in this adaptation? What's sort of the thing that Eggers is getting at?
Yeah, I think it's the relationship between the central female character, Ellen, and Orlok. For me, that's where the movie is unique.
Lily-Rose Depp calling him into existence, if you will, or into being. It comes out of despair. It comes out of this desperate prayer.
Her performance. My background is in Japanese performance methods. The physicality, it very much is an athletic feat to do what she was doing.
Welcome to the Catholic Film Club, where we talk about craft and conscience. And if you're wondering why I've killed these beautiful flowers, it's because we're here to talk about Nosferatu, the new film from Robert Eggers. And so I'm very happy to have be joined by Dr. Nathan Bowman again to talk about a horror film. Thanks for joining us, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And of course, we're joined by Patrick Batista too, my fellow producer in this endeavor. Mm-hmm. So we all saw Nosferatu over the Christmas break. Perfect Christmas movie, you know.
Yeah.
Just really gets you in the holiday spirit.
One for the family.
Exactly.
Yes, very much.
For sure. The reason this is exciting is because this is a new movie by Robert Eggers. Mm-hmm. Thing. What's your all's history with Eggers?
I mean, I've seen all of his movies, and I mean, in terms of horror in the past decade, I mean, just in terms of filmmaking in the past decade, I mean, I can't think of too many more directors that are relevant and pushing boundaries the way and just innovating the way Eggers is.
And in command of their own style. Like, The Witch comes out. I don't know if he did anything before that, if he did like short films.
Some short films.
Other ones, but I haven't seen, so I've only seen The Lighthouse and Nosferatu. So I still have a few, The Witch and then The Northman.
Yeah, I haven't seen The Northman either. Yeah, he did The Northman.
He did. But by my accounts of what I've seen of production stills and just like trailers and whatnot, he has such a strong like understanding and in-tuneness of what he's looking to execute on screen that just seems to be in every single one of his films, which is why it's like such a treat to have a Robert Eggers film, because it's a treat to see a director know exactly what they want and go out and do that.
Yeah, and I've seen, especially in regards to this movie, a little bit of dismissiveness actually from critics who are kind of seeing him now as like the Wes Anderson of horror because he loves his proscenium arch and he loves his center framing and everything. But to me, that's just as dismissive as the critiques of Wes Anderson. Like, what do you want this guy to do?
Yeah.
This is like what he does.
And also, not to jump ahead, that perfectly symmetrical shot of the carriage with Thomas getting into it. Come on.
Probably the highlight shot of the movie for me as well.
Oh, so good.
And just like everything in this movie deepens, like it's inspired very closely by the original film and just deepens everything in it, I think. But first, I just wanted to ask, like, first takes, what were your all's expectations going into this, and were they met before we get into spoilers and sort of the themes of providence and evil and sacrifice that are at the center of this movie? Have you read the novel, Pat?
I have very little knowledge of Dracula. The only Nosferatu or Dracula-esque movie I've seen was this one. I had a kind of elementary understanding of what the story was, like as far as fairy tales go. I knew, vampire, I knew involvement with the occult, with darkness, with the society at that time, but I just kind of strapped myself in and was ready to be taken along this adventure. I had no idea really what to expect, so I was pleasantly surprised, I can say. And I always love when there are movies that come out that, after this podcast, we're still going to have so much more to talk about. Yeah. And like for years to come, there's going to be a lot that we're going to be unpacking with this film.
The big question I had going in was how much of this film was going to be a direct adaptation of the original 1922 silent film versus how much of the other Dracula lore was going to come in, right? Because there have been so many adaptations of the Dracula story. There have been remakes of Nosferatu, which maybe we can talk about later. And like, I'm thinking like, the Werner Herzog Nosferatu from 1979, like it's kind of a remake, but he actually like keeps the names from the Dracula novel in it. So like the Werner Herzog film is sort of this weird splicing of the original Nosferatu film with like more proper like Dracula stuff from the novel, right? Whereas like the original silent film, we all know like is basically the plot of the novel, but they changed all the names and everything. So it was one of those things I didn't know, like, was this going to be more, was this going to be more closely aligned with the silent film, or was he going to kind of bring in some of that other stuff from the Dracula novel? And then what I found was that it actually remained pretty closely tied to the original film. Like, he kept all the character names the same as the original film, which I actually really liked. I really liked that. The novel is really great, but it's very dense. It's very Victorian. And I've been watching some Eggers interviews, and Eggers talks about, like, one of the reasons he likes the original film is that it sort of distills the novel of Dracula down to just a simple fairy tale. And I thought that he really kept that in this movie. So in terms of what I expected, the answer is I don't know what I expected, but my question was, how much was this going to be strictly adhering to the original silent film versus the Dracula novel? And I kind of liked that he stuck to the original film.
I did too. It's because I read the novel last year because it was on the well-read mom reading list, and my wife was reading it, so I jumped on as well. Had never read it before, and I was really struck by how much of that classic imagery is based in the novel. And funnily enough, I don't know if this is a spoiler, the only thing he probably takes from the novel that isn't already in the 1922 movie, in the novel, Dracula has a big mustache.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
So I'm, as I mentioned prior to starting our recording today, like, I'm sort of in our Dracula rabbit hole right now. I've watched a ton of films this past week, and I'm working my way through the novel. This will be the second time I've read it, but it's been like 15 years since I read it the first time. And that was one of the things I noticed when it describes him. He has a mustache, and this is like the first mustachioed Dracula, Orlok, excuse me, that we get.
Yeah, I thought surely that will never happen. But then Robert Eggers, of course, the genius that he is, just brings it out. I think you should read the book. It's a very interesting one. It's epistolary, so it's all in letters and journals. So in a way, it's kind of like the first found footage horror.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't think of it that way.
It'd be fun to see an adaptation that takes that to makes it like a found footage Dracula or something. Maybe that's the next step. But well.
Can I just say real quick about that?
Totally.
One of the things that did stand out to me about this latest adaptation, the Eggers film, is that they kept Orlok so in the shadows and so in the dark. It was really hard to kind of make the details out until he really wanted you to see them. And one of the reasons I liked that is because the novel is written in the form of a bunch of first-person letters by various characters. Like, there's no central protagonist. In the novel, you only ever experience Dracula in as much as the character is able to experience Dracula. And so I thought the way that this film approached the Orlok Dracula character kind of helped with that, because there are some Dracula movies, I'm thinking like the Coppola one, for instance, where you just see what Dracula looks like. And for me, and in the Coppola film, one might argue like Dracula is the protagonist of that film. I would agree with that. Yeah. But one of the things I don't like about that is it sort of removes the mystery of the character. And like in the novel, because it's all first person from these other characters, you never get Dracula's perspective. And so I thought this movie did a good job of, by keeping him hidden, it sort of recreates that feeling of the novel where like you're only getting snippets from all these different perspectives of him. And that keeps that makes it scarier to me.
Yeah, well, I did want to talk about too, like what is Robert Eggers trying to add to the Dracula myth, I guess. I mean, it's a story created by Bram Stoker, but there have been adaptations throughout the years. There's, of course, the iconic 1930s Dracula, where, again, he's forefront. That one is actually really interesting because that movie does something I've only seen in that film. It's a very flawed movie, but it combines in this film, the Nicholas Hoult character and his boss, the Renfield character. So Renfield in the Dracula story is the person who sends Harker, the real estate agent, off to see Dracula, but he's already kind of corrupt. But in that adaptation, Renfield takes the place of Harker, and he becomes, after seeing Dracula, this slave to his power. So it's kind of a very tragic story by combining those two characters.
Yeah.
There was also a movie that came out a couple years ago called Renfield
with Nicholas Hoult.
Nicholas Cage and Nicholas Hoult.
Yeah, I had my list of Dracula movies through the years, and I missed that one.
Yeah, I missed that.
I think we all missed that one.
To go watch that one.
Yeah.
What are you guys doing after this?
So I wanted to know, just from your perspective, Nathan, what do you think is the primary thing that's been updated about in this adaptation? What's sort of the thing that Eggers is getting at that makes it worth seeing and making again?
Yeah, beyond just putting his style onto the story, which I think in and of itself, as we've talked about, is very important.
Absolutely.
I think that it's the relationship between Orlok / Dracula and is her name in the film Ellen?
Her name's Ellen. Yeah.
Ellen, that's right. In the novel, it's Mina. Yeah, I think it's the relationship between the central female character, Ellen, and Orlok. For me, that's where the movie is unique. Granted, those two characters in some form exist in most adaptations, but their relationship is like always different. It's like every filmmaker has a different way of interpreting the relationship between those two characters, and I really thought that the way this relationship was interpreted was unique.
Yeah, I'd say a stepping stone to it is the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula, because that does pitch their Mina and Dracula's relationship as like an epic doomed romance in a way. But in the original Nosferatu, it does have Ellen, the female protagonist, be the heroine at the end. But this is the first one that just right out the gate makes her the main character.
Right.
I think there's a question though, she's the protagonist for sure, but is she a hero? Is she, I don't know. I think once you lock into that perspective, that for me like opens up how to interpret the movie. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, whether or not she's the hero or not. I think it's interesting. So in the first one, she definitely sacrifices herself to stop him, right? And so I think definitely in the original silent film, I would argue she's definitely a hero. And Eggers talked about in an interview I watched how part of his kind of way of approaching Ellen in this one was that in the original silent film, we see that she has these dreams and we see that she sleepwalks. And he was talking about how like in the 19th century, people that had an issue with sleepwalking, they were thought to have sort of, they were thought to be in tuned with a sort of different kind of reality, right? And the silent film only grazes that by having her sleepwalking, but he talked about how he really wanted to like dive into this idea that Ellen as a character is more in tune with a different kind of reality that is different from 19th century Europe that's dominated by like the empirical sciences and all this stuff, which that it gets into that in this film as well. And that part of the tragedy of it is that the only person who understands or can kind of partake in this reality in the way that she views and interprets the world is Orlok. And that's why she's drawn to Orlok, because he's the only thing that understands the way she kind of perceives reality. Now, whether or not she's a hero in the end, I think is interesting, because she does sacrifice herself to stop him. But I think the way this movie frames it is that act is also her giving in to something that she clearly wants the entire film as well. So this film problematizes it a little bit. It is a heroic act that stops him, but at the same time in doing so, she's actually getting what she wants at the same time.
Yeah, and we should definitely
also kind of what he wants too.
Yeah,
which is her at the end.
I wondered, like, the other thing that is updated is Orlok as a character before we really dive into the spoiler discussion. But as a newcomer to the Dracula story, what did you think? This is your first exposure in film or literature to the Dracula or Nosferatu character. What was your perception of him as a character?
Sure. I think as a character, not just with this film, but with all the films and literary aspects to it. He's such a, like the character of Nosferatu and Dracula is such a really interesting metaphor for how we view evil as a society. And with the forefront question that's posed in this movie is, does evil come from within us or beyond? It's just a really, really deep way to explore evil in the world and then within ourselves, and how we view that with our fallen nature. That was one of the reasons why I was stoked for this movie, is because Eggers does such a pun intended. Eggers does such a great job of like talking and introducing us to these existential questions and leaving us with like a very complicated emotion at the end of it, where we never really feel a certain way. And what makes him such an effective storyteller is, I think that's one of the best ways to talk about horror and to feel about horror, is because it's not just one emotion; it's a bunch of complicated emotions of melancholy and sadness and sorrow.
And what did you think of Bill Skarsgård as Orlok Patrick?
He was unbelievable, and I don't have the other characters or actors that have played Orlok in the past to compare it to, but just like right from the gate, he's menacing. But
that's kind of why I'm interested, because a lot of people probably will be exposed to this. Probably will be their first exposure to Nosferatu.
I think it's a really good one, because it plays into him being like, the way he's framed within the shots are like he's framed in the shadows. He's gradually revealed. We don't really we see partial glimpses of his face or his figure, but he's in the shadows because he is the shadows.
We see a glimpse of his mustache peeking into the moonlight, but we don't, but not quite the firelight. But
the mustache reveal was why I was so ready for the end to see the full glory of his mustache.
He's also so decrepit too. He seems he's diseased. There's something about him there.
I heard they used real maggots.
What? Well, that's funny, because you can. I mean, I don't know. This is a side. This is Michael's medical corner, but maggots are still used to treat wounds at certain points, because they can. It seems very medieval, but that. So
I also heard Eggers used 5,000 trained rat actors for this.
Just rat actors, like they were
like trained rats.
Andy Serkis, like
basically,
like
they went to
performance
school.
capture, or was it like performance capture?
They went to
USC. Okay. Excuse me. Like, no offense to the people the fine people at USC.
No.
What's something that really stood out to you? Is there performance or aesthetic or?
I mean, Bill Skarsgård's performance was. I had no idea it was him.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have zero idea. Like, I was blown away when, after I saw the movie, I missed it in the credit, I think. After I saw the movie, I went and read up, and I was like, that was Bill Skarsgård. Blown away, had no idea it was him.
Yeah.
No idea. The thing that the thing that struck me right off the bat early on in the movie was that Thomas, who named Jonathan in other Dracula adaptations, I really felt like I understood what his perspective was and what he was feeling and the terror he was feeling while he was at the castle, in a way that I don't necessarily know that I felt in other adaptations. Like, I really, and part of it, and I don't even know if, I think sometimes I was a little bit like, I just want to be able to see a little bit more, because like when he's at the castle, like it's really dark, like it's very desaturated, Well, the entire movie is, but like when he's in that castle, like it's so hard to see anything. Sometimes I wanted to see just a little bit more, but maybe that was the brilliance of it, is that it made me feel that way. But that's what struck me early on, just an experience, is that I felt like I understood that character's experience a lot more.
Yeah.
Than
There's
other
one quick thing I want to add is, like, on a technical level, I found that aspect of like very little to no lighting within that castle scene so effective, because with this permeating sense of dread that makes horror films really effective. Like, I was the only one in the movie theaters. That was, another dread aspect. But within that,
as far as you know,
yes,
it's dreamlike.
It's dreamlike, but you find yourself at this contradictory action as an audience member where you want to lean forward and try and see and strain your eyes to see Orlok, but at the same time you want to lean back and be like, I want to see it, but I also don't want to see it because I'm terrified. It's so effective.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And I also love how you're talking about Thomas, because I mean the real standout here is Lily-Rose Depp, and we need to talk about her performance, but it does deepen his character as well. The Thomas or the Nicholas Hoult character, especially in Nosferatu, is kind of he's just a silly kind of know-nothing guy, and he's in a situation, but he's pretty happy-go-lucky, and he just seems kind of dim-witted. And of course, Keanu Reeves really updated that in his portrayal in Dracula. We all know that was a very sorry. No offense to Keanu Reeves. It's just a famous.
He does other things very well.
He does.
But not that movie.
He should have been Dracula. But that would be great. But you really feel for him because he is so out of his depth. But he just wants to be good. But he's pulled away from his wife by his ambition, but more of just like going along to get along. He's a bit of a yuppie in a way. And I felt bad for him, but you really feel bad for him because he is trying to connect. Well, he's just realizing that he's trying too late to connect with his wife.
Right.
And
meanwhile, she's connecting with this other force.
Exactly. It's exactly. And Lily-Rose Depp, I'd never seen her in anything before.
Me neither. And
she was just the standout performance of the year for me. She'd probably get no recognition for it. This is just another in a long line of great horror female performances that, like Toni Collette in Hereditary.
That's one I always go to.
Lupita Nyong'o in Us. And these are just performances that just get wiped away. And
I think one of the reasons why maybe it doesn't get a lot of attention and why I think it's such an underrated range of emotions to give as an actor is because what we were talking about with the complications with horror. It's not something simple as like displaying horror, because there's like 5 other things within horror to try and display as an actor. But she immediately takes you on this journey where you're following along with her character, and you're like, you see so like 100 different, like the entire human spectrum of emotions you see with her. You see like joy, but it's twisted. You see
inhuman.
And yes, very much.
Well, let's get into spoilers because we see the character.
I probably already have. Sorry.
I think if people don't think Dracula dies at the end of a Dracula movie, then then you have more hope in the world than I do. I'm gonna open my bottle for a crisp. Okay, perfect.
ASMR.
Crisp H2O.
Okay, that's the. So we start with Ellen, and she is calling out to a spirit, any spirit. Maybe that was the bad word choice there. Any spirit to help her, and she's attacked by this. Well, how did you interpret that? This beginning, because like we could even just focus purely on the beginning and the end to really think about how to analyze her character and what it's trying to say about these things. Did you have any thoughts, Pat?
No, I'm like,
you're terrified?
I'm terrified. I'm still trying to figure out what.
No, okay, sorry.
I'm trying to figure out what her state of mind was and state of being was in this prayer, if you will, for.
She calls out to a guardian angel.
Yes.
At first. And then she asks for a spirit of comfort. And then this voice of Count Orlok comes to her. I don't think she knows what it is at this point, or maybe she does. I'm a little. She has a history we've seen. What did you get out of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's, for me, like pretty clear that Eggers doesn't want you to know everything about that encounter. Because I had a lot of questions like, I mean, is this the first time they've encountered each other? Like, why was Orlok in whatever form present here to begin with? Like, I had a lot of questions about that the initial encounter, but I think ultimately we're just left with there was an encounter, and that encounter years later seems to affect both of them. What that encounter was, I think for the character of Ellen, it was, I think for her, the important thing is that's the first time she's ever felt something connect with her worldview or the way she views reality. I think that's the, in a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, there's the, I mentioned it earlier, like the idea that she's connected to a plane of existence that like ordinary people who are obsessed with like the empirical sciences and whatever are not. But I also think then there's that whole like, you know, he said, I mean, the line is like maybe like encapsulates the entire perspective of it, which is I am appetite, nothing more, right? Is a line he has. And I think that's the other part of it, right? Is that like she's encountering, you know, it's the first time she's encountered this thing that can view her perspective of reality, but it's also like awakening like deep, dark desire within her as well.
Yeah, it seems to be, and our shout out to our producer Grant was saying as well, that it's like it represents Orlok. You could just see him as a direct representation of her own desire. He's manifest, like it is in horror. You're making the sort of emotional internal manifest into a creature, but that to me that opens up the movie and a way to understand these themes that it's breaking out here.
And for me, if I can say that made Orlok's motivation make a lot more sense to me than in other adaptations. In the novel, he just kind of wants to spread his disease throughout the world. And I'm like, I get that, whatever. There's not really that sort of relationship between those two characters in the novel, which is fine. But in other adaptations, every adaptation tries to figure out what they want that relationship to be. And in this one, you know, they encountered each other before, and so that's why he wants Thomas to come visit him, right? His whole motivation to coming, to moving, is to get closer to her. And it's not just kind of like happenstance. Like in other adaptations, it's like the Jonathan Thomas character just happens to go to sell him this house, and he just happens to see the picture of his fiance or wife, and then just, you know, it's all just very happenstance. And in the whole reincarnation thing and the Coppola thing, that did not work for me.
It didn't? Okay.
No, the whole like, oh, they were lovers in a past life thing, for me, it just didn't work. Yeah, and then he just happens to call the guy who's married to his reincarnated love.
I haven't seen the movie, so I'm taking a step back from this one.
You know.
Well, I could, you know what? Your cards on the table. I won't defend that movie. I will eventually at a certain point, but not today. But there
are great things about the movie. Throwing that out.
The funny thing is that it's the thing that this movie clarifies. It has a point of view. Because you said that in other adaptations, Dracula just kind of wants to spread his own disease throughout. This is kind of changing him from a creature of pure ego to a creature of pure id. I mean, he says something very close to I am desire, I am hunger. And that's kind of why I am seeing him more as I'm interested in seeing it as Ellen's desire. It's very similar to that Kirsten Dunst, Lars von Trier movie Melancholia, where there's a planet that represents her melancholy, and it is coming to Earth, and it will succumb. Everyone will be destroyed by this. But in this movie, a similar thing is coming. Ellen is. We're gonna have to do some kind of. We have to make our own. Lily-Rose Depp is calling this to her, and she is repelled by it. But she does have a moral center, and she in the 1922 movie she makes a self-sacrifice, but this one it again deepens what the silent film was doing, because she has agency in calling Nosferatu to this place, and therefore it's her responsibility, I think she feels, to destroy it. That's just a wonderful rounding out of this character while maintaining the fairy tale quality of it.
I like the way you phrased it, that in this one, in the Eggers film, she feels a sense of responsibility. Because, and that's interesting because of the fact that, like, in this one, it is more explicit that Orlok is there because of her. And so I think the idea that, like, the added sense of responsibility is, that's a good way of putting it, I think.
I think there's also a scene closer to, like, beginning of Act 3 when Nicholas Hoult returns, and I think they're, like, lying in bed together, and he wakes up and he repels her because I think he says something along the lines of, like, you brought this evil to us. And that's kind of, like, the catalyst that forces her to really take responsibility for that.
Going off topic here just a little bit, sorry, because you were just kind of talking, I guess going back to what we were talking about, which is just her performance. The physicality of the performance. Like, just as like an actor and an actor trainer, like, I usually do, like, movement-based methods. So, like, watching the way she, like, can just contort herself. Like, the physicality of that performance was amazing.
So she was inspired by Butoh dance. That was a specific thing. Is this something that you encountered in your education?
Yeah, actually, my background is in Japanese performance methods.
Excellent. Okay, so
not Butoh specifically, but I'm very aware of it.
Well, tell us about that. How did you, like, when you're watching her performance, what are you seeing? What are the intricacies of what she's doing that you're seeing?
Yeah, well, it takes a lot of muscular exertion to do what she's doing without anybody. I shouldn't say anybody, but a lot of people can do what she's doing, but in a way that's going to put a lot of strain on their joints and their bones, right? But, like, anybody can kind of, like, crank their back or their neck that way, but they will hurt themselves. I think a lot of people don't understand the amount of training it takes to be able to do that stuff take after take, or if you're doing theater, night after night, performance, to be able to do that stuff, repeating it over and over without hurting yourself. It takes a lot of training, often centered on breath support, that people, I would say most people don't understand just the amount of training it takes. It very much is an athletic feat to do what she was doing.
And by all accounts, it's all her. There's no computer generated imagery added. There's no wire work. It's like all of that is her, and she needs that. And I mean,
Butoh training and other sort of more physical styles of actor training, much of it involves just endurance and strength training. That when you look at it from the outside, doesn't necessarily look directly related to acting. Like a lot of the exercises I have people do and I work with them, like, they'll, like, stomp in a circle for, like, a long time, and it wears them out and it builds their legs and their core strength. And you look at it from the outside and it's like, what does this have to do with acting, right? But there's a lot of conditioning and training that goes into it that, from an outsider's perspective, you're like, you might be like, what? That's not acting. That looks ridiculous. But it's, I always use the example, like, take any sport, right? Like, if a basketball player is going to the gym to, like, curl or do leg lifts or something, the act of doing leg lifts is not the act of playing basketball, but you have to do that conditioning work in order to play the sport. And it's the same thing with physical actors, right? They do a lot of work that doesn't look like it doesn't look like they're acting, but it very much is related.
It built so much the believability for me with what you said to how much physical strength and exertion she gave, because there's probably a bunch of the scenes with her, shaking and contorting. A lesser actor, it might not have been as believable in a scene it's required for it to be so believable, and just the way it was, like, terrifying seeing that, and it was hence made it so effective. It's just you immediately believe that everything she's doing is so real.
You're saying she needed an exorcist, which and talk about another, like, Linda Blair. She had a lot of physicality, and she's hurting still because she didn't have that training of how to throw herself around. What did you think of Bill Skarsgård's performance physically? Like, what were you seeing there?
I mean, I can only imagine the strain that much, like, prosthetic was putting on his
I
body.
heard it was like
probably.
6 hours of makeup or
Yeah, he
prosthetics.
said for the full body, he said he was in makeup for 6 hours. And then for just hands and face, it was like 3. Yeah.
Unbelievable. But you're talking about like things that seem chaotic and yet are so controlled. I think that fits perfectly into the aesthetic of the movie. It's something Eggers does a lot. He's throwing grenades into the lives of his characters, but he is portraying it with such like ultimate control.
Yeah.
And I think that creates a really unique feeling for the audience of there is a bit of chaos, but there's also just like an aesthetic control there.
Yeah. And I think with Skarsgård's performance, I think one way of thinking about it, and I actually, I think Eggers actually referred to it this way as well, but it's a lot like mask work. Like a lot of actors, a lot of theater productions use masks, and a lot of actors train with masks. And a lot of that is, the idea of mask work is, how do we communicate things with our voice, with our body, when we don't necessarily have the tool of our face. And I think thinking of his performance as mask work is kind of useful because for most of the movie, he doesn't have the use of his face. He has the use of his silhouette, so that might affect the way he puts a shoulder out or something. So he has the use of his silhouette. He has the use of his voice. And even when we see his face, he has so much prosthetic on that it's not really his face, right? So
The thing that stands out is the eyes, but they're used sparingly. And it's very deliberately shown of just like these gigantic, powerful eyes that he has.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating thinking about it from that perspective. Do you mind if we move to just jump to the ending? Because the ending has been, even among like my friends and everything, the point of contention for several reasons. My friend said he found it kind of anticlimactic. I don't think I don't know if he'd seen many Dracula or Nosferatu portrayals before. Another friend of ours, John, was saying that he was put off by the sacrifice. He just didn't know what to make of the sacrifice also being a sin in a way. But what did to remind people, because we're in spoiler territory, the Lily-Rose Depp is fulfilling a prophecy of a kind. I don't even think purposefully, but Willem Dafoe, as his version of Van Helsing, has identified this prophecy in which the Nosferatu will be drawn to a woman, and she will sacrifice herself to him in order to keep him sort of ensnared so that the sunlight will kill him. And that's sort of the goal of the final film. And in the 1922 version, that is done, but sexuality is not an overt aspect of the actual text of the film. Right. It's a subtext in all of Dracula, but this is overt, and she makes an overt action. But just maybe like zooming out a little bit, what was your all's first perspectives on the ending and what that signified?
Yeah, it was tragedy was kind of the first word that popped into my head, where it was like there's a victory, but how much of it should we be celebrating? And Nathan, that's kind of why I wanted to throw it over on your end, because you have a profound understanding of Greek tragedy. So like the way I was interpreting it was it's tragic, and it reminded me of a bunch of different stories, but like Romeo and Juliet-esque, of just like the sacrifice that's made for a love to a certain person or a certain, greater good that Lily-Rose Depp does at the end of the movie. So yeah, I don't know what you thought about that with your relation to like other stories that you might be able to see the connection with.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess from the perspective of like tragedy, like Greek tragedy specifically, usually the outcome of the story, like, the violent outcome usually of the story has to do with a sort of balancing. Like that there's, something in the world is imbalanced. Usually it has to do with somebody having too much pride or hubris, or they made an error or something. And then that needs correction. Things need balanced, right? And so then the outcome is, the gods balancing the scales, as it were. And I think maybe you can kind of see that in this film as well, that there's a sort of balancing taking place at the end, right? That the only way this can end is for this culmination of both of their desires and then death. And it's interesting with the idea of sin and how that plays into this balancing act. They're both. You brought up, that she's sacrificing herself. It's an act of heroism, but the role that sin plays in that as well, right? And so she's getting what she wants, which we can interpret as like a sin, right? The thing that she wants is, desire, appetite, like he says, but it is killing her too, right? Like, like that to give in to what she wants is for her to die, I'm just kind of, no.
It's a very complicated, just like thing to unpack.
Well, she has this dream that she after she asks, "Why did you kill these beautiful flowers?" Which I mean, you could interpret as just as asking. I think it's a pretty blatant metaphor for like her loss of virginity, and But she talks immediately after that, after she's angry at her husband for killing the flowers, that she had a dream about their wedding night, but he wasn't there. It was death. And she held hands with death, and everyone around her was dead. But that was the first time that she felt complete happiness. And so I don't know if there's a moral standpoint out there. It could just be like a very elegant psychological portrayal of depression, or of someone feeling that they can't shake off these things that are wrong with them, and so they feel they have to give in to them in order to feel fulfilled as a human being, I suppose. I don't know if there is but the thing is, you can't take morality out of this, because the vampire myth comes out of such a specific inversion of Christianity. Bram Stoker was an Irish author, so he's coming from a Catholic worldview, but Dracula and Nosferatu are kind of rooted in Protestant societies. Your London for Dracula, Germany was a Protestant society at this time, and so it's just very interesting. I don't know. And what Egger's perspective is on this, he might just be using it as an interesting existential metaphor.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, does he believe in evil? Does Robert Eggers believe in real evil?
Well, we have a seat for you, Robert Eggers, at this table.
Yeah.
Right there. You don't even have to face the camera. You're just being back there. But I don't know.
It's an interesting question, because I don't necessarily know that as a symbol I interpreted Orlok in this film as like an embodiment of evil per se. I mean, obviously as a monster, he does horrible, evil things, right? He, spoiler alert, kills those children, kills other people. So it's not that that's not there, but I think as like a sort of allegory, I interpreted it less as like evil per se, and I interpreted it more as like carnal desire, which is not unrelated to evil. But I more specifically interpreted it as that.
So could that question at the center does evil come from within or from beyond? Maybe it's just a begging the question. It's like maybe it's just saying it comes from within.
Yeah, maybe.
Based on your interpretation.
It's interesting, because like I feel like it kind of comes from both, because with our fallen nature, there is evil within us. There's our inclination towards sin, but it's not like, we're not evil creatures. We're created in the image and likeness of God. So, if the perspective of the filmmaker is that evil does come exclusively from within, I would disagree with that. But the film poses these questions in a very open-ended way, with like particularly the end of, I would say, objectively good triumphs over evil, but ... at what cost? And then that's kind of the thing to discuss is the the cost of this triumph worth the sacrifice itself?
Yeah.
And that's kind of thing to discuss and
What's
be
your
stumped on.
Well, it's interesting. Can I just,
Absolutely.
because the idea that like, I mean, if, you know, rooting it to the faith tradition, you know, that is the tradition, right? Is that a sacrifice has to occur in order to triumph over sin, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know where I'm just throwing that out there. You know,
I mean,
'cause-
Orlok is also he's a spirit. He's a. I mean, they do define it ultimately in the movie. There's a Russian or an Orthodox of a kind nun at the convent where Nicholas Holt ends up, and she says I have the line here somewhere, but she basically says that he. I really have to get this line
pull it
correct
up.
because nothing in this adaptation. There's no word that's gone to waste. He is a black enchanter. A black enchanter he was in life, Solomonare, which is a Romanian wizard. And the devil preserved his soul that his corpse may walk again in blaspheme. Now, maybe that's just her interpretation of it, but he seems pretty magical and wizard and imbued with the dark powers to me. So
I think in this one, because of the fact that, I mean, in most adaptations, you can tell he has powers beyond what his body is capable of, right? Like in the Coppola, you know, all these shadows are doing things.
Totally.
But I think definitely one of the things that this one does is in making his body basically like literally a corpse, a pretty rotting corpse at that. I think it definitely does highlight this idea that he, as a character, is a force beyond just what is his body. Like it's sort of, his body's just a rotting corpse, right? And so it does kind of play into this idea that he is something significantly more than just his body in a way that maybe other adaptations don't.
Well, I want this. We could go on this obviously for a long time. I just want to ask, just some final thoughts on the film and what you got out of it and what you're going to be looking for the next time that you watch it. Because we'll be talking about this for years.
And I am going to watch it again.
I really wish that I had before we started this discussion.
I tried to.
I pulled up the script on Deadline, and so I was just like frantically like, what did they say again? Yeah.
There's one little thing I want to add off your point, Nathan, about how you see Nosferatu as like carnal desire. One aspect of this version of Nosferatu that I saw him represent was despair, because with his relationship to most of the characters, there's some sense of despair that comes in for Lily-Rose Depp calling him into existence, if you will, or into being. It comes out of despair. It comes out of this desperate prayer for him to feed on the fear of everyone and the plague that he, is a representation, like an extension of himself. There's despair. You see the entire town descend into chaos. The Aaron Taylor Johnson, he dies out of despair after Nosferatu kills his wife and children.
Oh, there's horribly disturbing.
Horribly disturbing.
And then I mean, it's necrophilia.
Yes.
I mean, and that's like another literal, and you're going to see another representation of this at the end of the film.
But there's a really interesting aspect that he brings to every single character of desperation and despair that I think kind of ties into him being appetite, him being carnal desire, because I think there's a close relationship with the two.
Yeah. And we didn't really talk about the whole disease.
Oh my
issue
gosh.
of the
Let's
movie,
talk about it.
which is not even in the novel. Like that's just from the silent film, I think.
Interesting.
It was an invention for the silent film that they kept. The disease portion of it, I think, like when I watch it again, I think I would like to think a little bit more on that. And kind of what does that kind of represent on an allegorical level? Is it that these things is it that, like, the things that Count Orlok represents, whether they be manifestations of Ellen or not, like affect us communally? Like, I don't know what that, but the disease element of it, I think is interesting. Now you mentioned maybe before we started talking, like the, recording, that maybe there's like a COVID overlay here. And it's interesting that the original silent film also came right off the Spanish influenza.
Oh yeah.
And so the question is, or the answer is, I don't know, but I would be interested in, when I watch it again, to think a little bit more about that element of like this idea that he brings plague with him.
And COVID did increase our feeling of guilt for bringing plague to an enormous degree. I think guilt was an emotion that was being felt a lot, and and that's why we kind of found ourselves in this strange situation. It seems like we bring up COVID. Just it is living. It's just oh my gosh. It's just even in our Christmas episode. But
what you were talking about with kind of wrapping things up, one of my thoughts was I'm not a big horror fan in general. I just don't love a lot of horror films, but this was one that whenever I do watch one, and the ones that I tend to enjoy are things that have a lot to discuss and a lot of debate. And I'm going to be asking myself questions about this movie for a long time. And I love when there's emotions that you're like still trying to figure out what they really mean in the years to come. So I will be rewatching this again for sure. And I'm glad that it exists and that we have something really fascinating to talk about.
Same. The thing that I'm going to be thinking about that I just could not wrap my head around yet was its view of providence. Because that's the other, we're talking about tragedy. Well, the other version of that is providence, fate versus providence. Providence is, because it is shouted several times very loudly in this film by one particular character. But what is that view? What is the view of, like, is it because the providence is the hand of God? Is the hand of God at work in this fable, but by Robert Eggers' point of view? That's
well, I think. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I had no answers.
There's a scene, and I don't know the exact quote, and as you said, words are used very specifically in this movie. But there's a scene in which Willem Dafoe's character, the Van Helsing character, I think his name is Von Franken in this movie, he's explaining to people, he's trying to explain to the character, a couple of the other characters, the other doctor, the Aaron, or what's his name?
Aaron Taylor Johnson's the actor.
Taylor Johnson, he's trying to explain to those two characters what he thinks is happening. It's the one before he says the name of the movie,
yes.
The vampire, Nosferatu, right? It's leading up to that, and he's like, and I think maybe this is a little bit of Eggers' perspective too. Having seen all of his movies, I really think that this is part of Eggers' perspective, is in some degree, there's a sort of critique of modernism in it, that this idea that modern society has become so obsessed with the empirical, with the material, that we lose a sense that there are other ways of viewing the world and other realities surrounding us, within us, that the modern world doesn't seem to have time for. And Willem Dafoe's character has a monologue where he basically says that. And I very much think that's Eggers' perspective. Is that I think to some degree there is a kind of critique of modernism in his films in some way. And that you see often in his films a sort of force overpowering, a force that is overpowering the way the world and the people within it want it to work.
Yeah, I see that. You see that in The Lighthouse. You see that in The Witch as well. I haven't seen The Northman yet, but gosh, I'm going to be looking at it from that point of view. I'm excited to see what he does next, because this is a movie that he's wanted to make before he even started making movies. And I always want to see, what does a filmmaker do after all their dreams have come true, you know? Or their nightmares, so to speak. Well, Nathan, thanks for coming on again. Every time I have you on, I want to keep talking so much more about
I know.
Stuff.
We can we'll cut the camera. We could just talk about this.
Okay.
And coffee.
Thanks Patrick too, and thanks producer Grant. And I just want to say this to our audience before I close out, and just right in my camera here. Don't succumb to the darkness. don't do it. I'm just going to say that's my prescription on this episode. And then we'll cut to a wide, and I'll just say thanks to everyone for tuning in. This has been the Catholic Film Club, brought to you by the Center for Catholic Media at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. God bless.